If there is one thing that Marvel has proven themselves to be in Phase 4, it is consistent. They are consistently bad. So bad that I can barely bring myself to watch these movies anymore. They are a joke. Everything about them screams, we don't care about the audience, we don't care about the characters, we don't care about the stories, and we don't care whether you care. Marvel simply doesn't care. And Thor Love and Thunder is just another nail in the coffin of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Who would have thought that when Marvel released Endgame, that was it? That was the last hurrah. From that point, Marvel has gone downhill faster than a wagon full of Hollywood sex offenders. It is like a Peruvian avalanche, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. It is so sad, as comic book fans have waited a long time for technology to catch up with fantasy, and to make the impossible possible on the big screen. But before I get started, please consider subscribing, as that would really help me out. And if you like this content, give it a like. Okay, on with the vid. I really didn't like Thor Ragnarok. It made a laughingstock of both Thor and the Hulk. It changed them from serious, interesting characters into clowns. The only thing missing were the face paint and a stupid little car that they just didn't fit in. And the reason for this is that Taika Waititi thinks that comic books are just for children, and he can't get his head around the idea that adults make up a very large share of the comic buying public. And so, Thor Love and Thunder is a movie aimed at 7-year-olds, which is a little strange considering it has a PG-13 rating. Chris Hemsworth described the movie as Taika Waititi's inner child running free, and said that Taika told him, if a 7-year-old was making this movie, what would you do? This movie is just one step above the Teletubbies, and has about as much emotional weight. It isn't meant to be taken seriously at any point. There are no serious lines of dialogue that aren't immediately turned into a joke of some form. The only person who actually manages to add some small amount of gravitas to his role is Christian Bale, whose agony over losing his daughter and realising that the gods don't care does actually ring true and is relatable even outside of the movie. But while he may be a good actor, and he has certainly put himself through hell for his art, in this movie he feels like any other cookie cutter bad guy. He doesn't feel like a threat, and he doesn't fill you with worry for the safety of the cast. The reason for that is simply that every single thing in this movie is a joke. Children are kidnapped. Oh, ha 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 ha. Jane is dying of cancer. Ha 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 ha. Gods get killed. Oh. This movie would find a way to take the piss out of childhood leukemia given the chance. The movie starts out by telling the story of Gorr, a man who, after his civilization is destroyed by drought and his daughter dies through lack of water, somehow stumbles across the god that he had been worshipping and who he was hoping would be his and his daughter's salvation. Unfortunately for him, gods lean towards being dicks, and his was no different. So when he tells the god of the destruction of his civilization, the god just says, "Oh well, you mortals were put here to suffer, and there is no afterlife. And anyway, there'll be another bunch more of you believers along at some point, so why should I care what happened to you?" Gorr is understandably upset by this answer, and it just turns out that this god has just hunted and killed some alien who had obtained a sword that kills gods. The sword then proceeds to have a life of its own, and helps Gorr to kill the god by basically appearing in his hand while the god strangles him. He then stabs the god, and so the butcher of the gods is born. Taika Waititi has obviously been spending a lot of time with Jar Jar Abrams, as this movie flows along in almost exactly the same way that Star Wars Rise of Skywalker did. There was no setup to anything. There is no rhyme or reason or explanation for anything. Everything is pure coincidence and happens because it needs to happen. People know things because it's required that they know it. Things are there because they need to be there. The movie is lazy as f***. Another thing that bothered me in the intro is that Gorr manages to kill what is obviously a very powerful god with little to no effort, thanks to the sword with a mind of its own doing all the work. But, and this is what bothers me, the god in question just hunted and killed the previous wielder of the sword, so unless he was unbelievably lucky, he clearly knew what he was doing and should have been ready for something like this to happen. It just doesn't make sense that he was so complacent about the sword, and had even just left it lying there on the floor. It is yet another symptom of this movie's unbelievably lazy writing. Anyway, moving on from the giant plot hole, we get a quick montage of how fat Thor got himself back into shape because apparently Thor isn't as progressive as Calvin Klein and wanted to look as though he wasn't one slice of bacon away from a heart attack. Thor is back to being himself and being, well, comedy Thor-like. He is hanging around with the Guardians of the Galaxy in what is probably the highlight of the movie, and being exuberant, silly, and destroying valuable cultural wonders of otherworldly civilizations while defeating aliens that look like owls. He then quickly abandons the Guardians when he learns from Sif that someone is going around killing gods, one of which he knew. Sif warns him that the Butcher of the Gods is targeting Asgard next. In the meantime, we find out that Jane Foster has stage 4 cancer, and in her desperate search for a cure, she finds out that Mjolnir supposedly gives the wielder health benefits. So she then goes to Asgard, on Earth, or whatever, and looks at the broken remains of Mjolnir. Who knows what she was expecting to happen? Was she expecting to try eating it, rubbing it on her face, or making one of those health bracelets? Who the bloody hell knows? What she probably wasn't expecting was for the parts to then suddenly jump around with lightning and reform back into a hammer, though not permanently, as the parts don't actually mould back together. Thor then arrives in Asgard just in time to find everyone running around fighting shadow monsters, which are Gorr's first line of attack. He then finds that Jane is now female Thor, or Mighty Thor, as she wants to be known, and she got a bit upset with Gorr when he called her Lady Thor, which is no doubt Taika having a bit of a dig at those that were bothered by the whole female Thor thing. Anyway, the attack was just a distraction so that Gorr could abduct the Earth Guardian children and use them as a lure to catch Thor, so that he can steal Stormbreaker, then go to the center of the universe and use it to break open the gates to Eternity. And it turns out that Eternity is a super powerful being at the center of the universe who will grant one wish to the first person to reach him. And Gorr wants to go there to ask him to destroy all the gods. And we learn all this in a single line of dialogue, because obviously this is the Jar Jar Abrams method of storytelling, whereby nothing has to make sense, and vitally important plot details are introduced on a whim, when required, because God forbid you actually write an intriguing plot that is fully formed and captivatingly interesting, when you can simply make things up as you go along. It is utter nonsense. So along the way, Thor and co go to some place where apparently all the gods like to hang out together, because obviously they don't have any godding to do, and can simply goof off all of the time. The ringleader of the goof-off gods is Zeus, played by the rotund Russell Crowe using his Robin Hood voice again, and not even trying to look the part of Zeus of legend, instead looking a bit more like this guy, and having about as much gravitas. He is a clown, which it has to be said is not out of place because everyone in this movie is a clown. They are all the butt of a joke, or they are the joke, and they simply don't know it yet. Thor and co had intended to try and recruit the gods to come and give him a hand dealing with Gorr the God Butcher. But the gods are all scared and huddled together in the Hall of Goofing Off Gods because it is secret and they are safe there. Thor then compromises and asks Zeus if he can borrow his Thunderbolt, since it is such a powerful weapon, but Zeus, played by the planet-shaped Russell Crowe, says no, and instead decides that he must keep Thor and co prisoners, just in case Gorr asks them where the gods are hiding. It is at this point that we learn about Eternity, and the Wish, which Zeus just suddenly opines out of nowhere that must be Gorr's goal, and he's right. I guess because he is the father of Olympic gods, in which case he is all-knowing. And surely he could have made sure that these events never took place, and that Gorr never got hold of the god-slaying sword. I guess a possible answer to his lack of action is that he is just too fat to get out of bed, and by the time he managed to waddle his ass out of his bedroom, Gorr had already got the sword and started killing gods. Or then again, perhaps it is just the really crap, lazy script writing and plotting. Somehow, I think it's probably the latter. And then to top off the joke level of the movie, Thor kills Zeus. Yes, you heard that right. Thor kills Zeus. Thor, don't get me wrong, is a very powerful character, but he is not anywhere near on the level of Zeus, who according to Marvel is a Skyfather level god. And yes, I'm sure there will be arguments involving Thor using the Odin Force, but even then there is no way that it would go down the way it did, especially killing him with his own weapon. So after killing Zeus, Thor and co go off to Gorr's hideout, where they find out about the trick to take Stormbreaker and use it to open the gates to Eternity. Of course, Gorr then takes Stormbreaker and uses it to open the gates to Eternity. So, well, that happened. Gorr manages to injure Valkyrie so badly that she has to drop out of the battle, and Thor discovers that Jane is dying of cancer, and that it is probably Jane's use of Mjolnir that has made her unwell even faster than she would have been. And also, Gorr has taken the children to the gates of Eternity. So he then tells Jane to please stay here and don't use Mjolnir, then goes off to rescue the children, which he does by imbuing them with his own powers. They then beat off the shadow monsters. That sounds bad. They then beat the shadow monsters off while Thor battles Gorr. And even though he has shown on a couple of occasions so far that he is more powerful and can beat him up, still manages to end up on the losing side of the fight. Then here comes the mighty Thor. And by mighty Thor I mean slim petite Jane Foster, who may or may not have had CGI to boost her physique. They certainly admit to using it to make her look taller. Anyway, she saves Thor but doesn't manage to save the world because Gorr gets to eternity. Luckily, Thor gives a little speech about love, and Gorr suddenly realises that he can bring his daughter back instead of wishing to kill all the gods. So he does that. And guess what his daughter's name is? Love. Yes, this movie is all cliched, and by that I mean it is one massive stupid cliche. So Jane dies in Thor's arms and turns into shiny dust, which is a good clue that her story isn't done just yet. Thor seems less upset than you would have thought, considering she is the love of his life, but hey, plenty more fish in the sea. By the end of the film, we find out that Zeus actually isn't dead, or at least not yet, and he's decided to send his son Hercules to get revenge for him. Kind of understandable, really, after what happened. The children are returned, and Thor goes off again to have new adventures, starring in the now we understand the title of the movie bad guy fighting duo of Love, Gorr's daughter wielding Stormbreaker, and Thunder, Thor wielding his beloved Mjolnir once again. Yes, they are now Love and Thunder. Thor has decided to team up with a prepubescent little girl. Oh dear God, this is so goddamn stupid. Which maybe means it is perfect for a movie that really doesn't seem to care about anything. Certainly not Thor, and certainly not storytelling. It is essentially Taika Waititi waving his dick in people's faces and saying, I can do anything I want and I don't care how offensive or stupid it is because I'm Taika f***ing Waititi. Bow down and worship my nuts. He really is utterly detestable and everything wrong with the current comic book movies. He doesn't care about anything but himself, and anything he makes is just a big screw you, I do what I want to the fans. He even said, I'll ruin your mythos in a minute, baby. The acting in Thor Love and Thunder is fine. Chris Hemsworth is as ever great as Thor, and seems to have hit the gym steroids harder than ever. Queen Amidala, Natalie Portman that is, the writer of terrible woke revisionist fairy tales, does fine, though she was never amazing in these movies to start with. I actually wasn't bothered by her playing female Thor because really not much was made of it. I was expecting a lot more harping on and blowing her trumpet, but she was actually lower key than expected. And as ever, the reason for that was because Taika seemed unable to deal with serious issues, and would rather take the piss out of everything, particularly Thor himself. Also, the Asgardians have now become essentially just normal humans, living just the way we do on Earth, which means that there is no mystery or interest in their existence. They aren't special. Asgard is now just another town on Earth, which for bizarre reasons has some woman who in actuality is just a town mayor prancing around as if she is queen. There is no way I'm going to call her a king. Just no. It reminds me of one of those obscure minor royals that are still called prince or princess, even though they live in a council house and have about as much chance of a throne as I have of flying a Lego spaceship to Mars and setting up the first colony using Meccano and those little plastic trees that come in old train sets. Thor Love and Thunder is a bloody mess. A mess that further maligns the character of Thor, and it isn't Jane Foster's mighty Thor that was the problem, though it certainly didn't help. No, the blame for this monstrosity is squarely on Taika Waititi's shoulders, and on the shoulders of Disney Marvel, who are doing their damnedest to bring modern, woke Marvel comics to the big screen. The audience for these movies is going to continue to fall because we aren't suffering superhero fatigue. We're suffering woke Marvel doesn't care about the fans, hires director that doesn't give a shit about the source material fatigue. This has been Movie Suck thinking, I didn't believe I could be any more sick of Marvel than I already was. But it turns out Marvel can always find a new low. Signing out, leave a like, share, subscribe, and I will catch you guys on the flip side.